Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. I am Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran, and today we are taking a look at one of the more recent news stories. This is the wounded Ukrainian defenders in the Azovstal steelworks being evacuated after surrendering to Russian forces, or at least reaching an agreement with Russian forces that Ukrainian forces would be transferring their wounded to Russia for treatment. Do me a favor, guys, before we get cracking into it. First off, there's nothing graphic here. This is just a news story, but do hit subscribe if you like this content, right? I really want to get to that 100K mark. I really want that silver plaque on my wall. And if you guys hit subscribe, it doesn't cost you anything, and it doesn't mean you're going to see every single one of my videos crowding your feed. It'll still just show you the ones that are most interesting to you. Okay. Now that you've done that, let's get into it. So this is talking about how buses from the Azovstal steel plant loaded up with wounded are being evacuated. So what's interesting is these look like they are deliberately converted buses functioning as ambulances. You can see they're converted to actually have what look like maybe stretcher racks, 1, 2, 3, 4. So it looks like they have the capacity for 6 on each side. A 12-person ambulance, that's pretty good. One of the things that we've found in at least the U.S. military is that there's what we call the golden hour. A golden hour is the idea that if you can get a wounded person, service member, civilian, even enemy combatant, to medical care within 60 minutes of them receiving their wound, then the chances of them surviving, or rather medical care, surgical care, a proper hospital, the chances of them surviving increase dramatically. And that is, of course, is a little bit of tail wagging the dog, right? Because the most severe wounds will kill within an hour, obviously. But it also indicates that evacuating casualties is almost more important than virtually any sort of battlefield medicine you can do. Unfortunately, for these defenders in Mariupol, they aren't able to evacuate. There is no rear area they could evacuate their wounded to. And so probably for them to reach this point where they're willing to trust the Russians with their wounded is probably an indicator that these wounds are severe. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of the problems that arise when you cannot evacuate your casualties, or the problems of just treating casualties. So they're being moved. I think the most severely wounded are being moved to a hospital. I've read allegedly that this was originally done as part of a POW exchange, that Ukrainian forces would be turning over Russian POWs to Russia, but supposedly the Russian parliament, which is largely figurehead, has denied that request, has said that Russia will not be turning over Ukrainian prisoners in exchange for Russian POWs, which is really a bad look if you're Russia. You definitely don't want your troops to be you don't want it to look like the government doesn't care about the soldiers fighting. So what are some of the issues involved in treating battlefield casualties in a place like Azovstal Steelworks? Well, the number one thing is that while we're talking about that golden hour time frame, right? There's not a danger of infection. Infections take time to set in and spread, and they can be very dangerous once they do. That's why getting your wounded to a hospital is going to give them the best chance to survive an infection. So the fact that they can't, that they're stuck inside the steel plant, the number one threat is that people take a wound and then it's followed on by infection. Infection is a lethal thing because, of course, and while no infection is good, it's extra brutal when you're talking about someone whose body is already compromised, obviously with a battlefield wound. You also run into problems in that many of the interventions that you want to do, for example, you may need to clamp an artery or do some sort of surgical intervention. Well, without a clean operating space, your ability to do a surgical intervention is extremely limited. You cannot, right? If you cannot open someone up and again, assess the damage that has been done to them internally, you can't do it without a sterile environment. You're going to open them up. You're going to invite in more foreign pathogens. And even if it turns out that there's nothing that severe internally wrong, you're still going to have this massive infection. You can also run the risk of foreign particulate or foreign bodies entering the body of the patient. And that is going to cause its own extreme host of problems. So again, you also don't have diagnostic tools. Again, so if you've taken a wound, right, a hospital is going to be able to do things like a CAT scan, an MRI. They're going to be able to look at blood work. There's so many tools available to a physician within a hospital to understand what exactly is happening to the patient. None of those things are available in the Azovstal steelworks. And so what medics may be doing is simply say, hey, we see an entrance wound. We know that a piece of shrapnel or bullet entered your body, and that's where our knowledge stops. We know you don't feel good. We know there's pain in the area. That doesn't help you know if it's a ruptured spleen, damaged liver, etc., etc. You just are going in blind. The only tool, as we discussed, available to even get an assessment of what has happened to the wounded soldier's body internally is to open up and look around. Well, obviously, you can't even do that. So what you're focused on at that point is supportive care. These are things like taking steps to maintain blood pressure, to dress wounds, to try to keep things as clean and free of foreign bodies as possible. But that's pretty much where you're at. There's not many other additional interventions you can take. So, and even the ones that you can take require bandages or saline or even just an antibiotic, all of which are undoubtedly in extremely limited supply. So eventually it makes sense, of course, that the Ukrainian defenders are going to say, hey, listen, we literally cannot care for these wounded. They will die. We have an obligation to them. And so we will strike a deal to turn them over to Russia with some sort of flimsy guarantee that the troops will be treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention. And actually, because it's so publicized, so focused on by the media, that probably may be the thing that ends up saving these soldiers' lives. And that's because Russia needs to do everything in its power to try to redeem itself on the international stage. It's subject to crippling sanctions. It is wildly unpopular. It has taken a massive, massive amount of losses in this fight. And so being seen as treating enemy POWs cruelly, inhumanely, not in accordance with the Geneva Convention is a real public relations nightmare for them. And as we've seen, public relations, it sounds silly to talk about public relations in the context of a war, but when there's a large public outcry globally, you can see just how bad that can be for an aggressor like Russia. The level of sanctioning, the level of wealth that's stored overseas, that's been seized, is tremendous. So anything they can do to rehab their image, they need to try to do. And if treating these Ukrainian defenders in a hospital in accordance with the Geneva Convention that states that while enemy POWs that you capture may not be, don't necessarily have to be treated above your own troops in terms of priority, they still have to have access to medical care more or less on par with your troops. In the U.S., I have done it. I have evacuated wounded combatants, people who tried to kill us, right? We treated them, stabilized them, and called an ambulance. And unfortunately, we weren't able to get them to a hospital in time due to the severity of their wounds, but it didn't matter, right? And this is what I had to tell my soldiers and even some other units that had, let's say, a lower level of enthusiasm for treating POWs. I was like, the Geneva Convention is clear. If we have treated all of our wounded soldiers and we've treated all civilians within triage, right? Obviously, you're going to triage it. Then our next we are required to treat this wounded combatant, and we treat them to the maximum extent possible. And, that's what we did. We said, hey, we're going to try to stabilize them, even though they're very wounded. We're going to call a medevac just like we would do with a civilian or one of our own soldiers, and we're going to do the right thing. But that is obviously not something we've seen the Russians necessarily comply with. We've seen a lot of actions and activities that violate the Geneva Convention, targeting civilian structures like schools, hospitals, religious sites, shooting civilians. So expecting the Russians to adhere to the Geneva Convention is sort of unlikely. But it's clear Ukrainians have no other choice, right? Even if there's a small chance their soldiers, their most seriously wounded soldiers, will survive, they still cannot take the chance. If there's a 100% chance they will not last inside the steelworks, and there's a 10% chance they will make it outside, they have to take that 10% chance. So anyway, guys, thanks so much for joining me on this kind of quick hit video. If you want access to some exclusive content, you want to check out Patreon, thanks to our Lieutenant tier patrons. And until next time, I'll see you guys later.